Greetings and salutations, fellow questioners. It's on. I've got Professor Emeritus of Astronomy or Physics and Astronomy from Michigan State, Horace himself, Horace Smith, noted author and just all around good guy. And he's come to take me to task on the Antikythera Device. So it's on. I don't have enough Jello for the wrestling match, but it's going to be good anyway.
Well, I'm glad to be here.
So before we get too far, I've got the link for your newest book that's coming out where you're going to talk about astronomy and I just got his name.
H.P. Lovecraft.
Lovecraft, thank you. This is why I'm terrible with names, folks. But you've got a couple other books out that I found rather interesting. Can they all find? Is there a website they can find all this on, or just Amazon?
They can pretty much be obtained on Amazon. A couple of them are technical books on pulsating stars that probably won't be of too much general interest, but there are a few more general ones. One on the Great Meteor Procession of 1913, where a stream of meteors stretched from Western Canada down to the South Atlantic. And there's one called Willimantic Skies. And you may not have heard of Willimantic. It's my hometown. And it's about things that were seen in the skies there and in New England in general, and reported mysterious things between the return of the aurora in 1719, after it hadn't been seen for a while, through the red skies, which were eventually traced to the Krakatoa volcano, through up to ending with mysterious airships over New England in 1909, and finally a Sputnik, which I was able to see, or at least its booster rocket.
Interesting.
And that's just a fun little book. And then there's a Civil War book based on family letters. Cruel War and Cursed Rebellion, Civil War Letters of Samuel Bliss. An interesting story, but a sad one because the poor fellow does not survive the war. But those can all be tracked down on Amazon. Well, hey,
no, I think we have a rather eclectic audience here, so I think there's more than a few people are going to be interested in that, particularly the Civil War stories. Although I am interested in Willimantic Skies. We've talked about that a bit on Mysterious Library. I'm a big fan of those kinds of things
because and that one is in color.
Yeah, there you go, in Technicolor, right next to I Dream of Jeannie. And again, this next one with Lovecraft, I'm fascinated. So
that one is not my sole work. It's I have a co-author, Eddie Guimont, who's a professor of history, and fortunately lives not very far from Providence, where Lovecraft lived, and was able to go over there and delve into the records and the things found as Lovecraft's youthful signature in a number of items that he was able to track down. So it was very helpful that he was in that area.
Yeah, well, that's a lot of fun. Actually, Dean, while he's working on his, I've heard some of the stories. I've actually been able to help him out on a few of the. Again, no spoilers here, but there's town record things that my experience with title have sort of been slightly helpful with. So those are always great stories to be able to go down and get this material and see the original documents yourself, see the signed documents. Okay, they handled this. This happened at this time. You can start putting things together that it's not usually in a normal record somewhere, right? No one was writing about it. It gives you these different perspectives on these people and their lives. And of course, that's the kind of material that's sort of missing, that leads to the confusion that we were talking about, that Donny and I have been talking about the last couple episodes on, the Bronze Age collapse and the events surrounding it and the things that happen afterward. And just to bring it back to our topic today, and just for anyone who may not remember the last episode, one of the things we were discussing was why the collapse happened. We don't know because depending on which archaeologist and historian you talk to, the collapse was a 50-year period or it's a 100-year period. It depends on who's looking where and when you want to put those hash marks on there. But we were looking at potential reasons for the overall collapse, and it seems like there's definitely way more than like one issue going on there. But one of the theories I put out there was the possibility of a loss of technology that allowed the Minoans to cross the Atlantic to go to the New World to obtain copper and bring it back. We've found float copper here. And again, that's all that episode. But I pointed out that the possibility of the Antikythera device being either itself a device from that time frame or a recreation of found technology from that time that allowed them to do that, and that was sort of lost to them, that precipitated the economic collapse that caused all these other issues. But you had some great pushback, and so I wanted to bring you on so we can wrestle this out in 3 rounds and explore this idea even more. So I'm going to take a step back now that we sort of set the stage here. I want to hear your thoughts. What did I get wrong?
Well, first of all, let me say that I'm glad you wanted to follow up on this and not send out a Texas hit team to remove me from the discussion. But one has to think about, first of all, what you need for celestial navigation,
Mhm.
and then how does that connect up? Does it connect up either directly or
Mhm.
indirectly with a device like the Antikythera mechanism?
Mhm.
Now, do we need to go over the Antikythera mechanism itself at this point, or do you want to hold off on that?
I think we could address it. I think it would be good to sort of set the stage. One thing I didn't do when we were talking about it was I only showed the blob, right, which is the majority of what we have. This is what was found. It's not the only. There are other fragments that have been found and processed, but this is the main artifact itself. However, what I did not do was show what is believed to be the best sort of guesstimate of what the machine would have looked like intact. Obviously, this is not, and it's a two-sided device for this is showing both sides, but this is the best sort of idea that we have of what this device may have looked like when it functioned, when it was used, and when it was designed. But we did not put this up here, so take it away, Horace.
Okay. The Antikythera device is believed to produce a number of results. You can use it to predict, for example, the phase of the moon, eclipses of the moon and sun,
Mm-hmm.
and the motions of the planets on the front dial. Now, by the planets at the time in ancient time, you're talking about the 5 planets visible to the naked eye, and Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, and it's really although there's a lot of problems still to be resolved with understanding how it worked, it's a tour de force of mechanical engineering for the time, for any time.
Yeah, I was about to say it's not just for the time; it's basically any time before the Middle Ages.
Right, and not until we don't see anything like it again until, as you say, the Middle Ages, where we have clocks, clockworks that give celestial motions. We have those in the later Middle Ages, We have in the early 1700s, we have what are now called orreries, usually mechanical devices like this to
Yep.
show the motion of moon and planets. So no one is going to argue against it being a wonderful
Hmm.
technological achievement that has to be based on not only a technological development of some sort, but a scientific development. You have to have a
Hmm.
theory that allows you to understand the motions of moon, of planets in the sky, of the sun in the sky. Uh, you
Hmm.
just can't, without that, you just can't. No matter how skilled your technological ability to make gears and combine them, without the scientific background, you couldn't build the Antikythera device.
Correct.
But, and
100%.
here's where I had some objections to the idea you raised, which was, what do you really need to make a device closely associated with
Hmm.
celestial navigation?
Right.
Basically, what you'd like to do
Hmm.
is perhaps have a device that will give you both latitude and longitude while you're on a ship.
Hmm.
And latitude and longitude are not conceptions of the Renaissance. They were, excuse me, they were developed. The idea of latitude and longitude go back to ancient times.
Hmm.
We know them at least back to the time of the Hellenic civilization, and exactly when they were developed is a matter of, and used in maps, is a little bit not well understood. Uh, but
Hmm.
when we approach this problem, latitude is the easy part. If you can measure, if you have a good picture of,
Hmm.
say, the celestial, where the celestial pole in the sky is, if you measure the altitude of the celestial pole above the horizon, the North Star today is pretty close to the North Celestial Pole. That gives you latitude. And you could even measure that from a tossing ship, if you're careful, without,
Yeah.
from observations, without being too far off. The big problem was longitude.
Correct.
Uh,
Yes.
that has no, latitude has the advantage that the rotation is defined by the rotation of the Earth. And all the altitude is defined by where you are on the Earth during for that rotation, and you don't need to know anything much about local time versus time at another location. But for longitude, you have to know, for example, the local time compared to the time at a distant city of some known latitude and longitude. And this is big trouble.
Yeah.
It was big trouble well into the not only the 1600s, but going into the 1700s.
Hmm.
So it was trouble well into the age of European uh,
Hmm.
civilizations in taking over in the New World. Uh,
Yep.
the uh, the Portuguese and the Spanish and others building their empires in the Americas.
Yep.
No clock at the time. If you can imagine, if you had a clock in, you're sailing from Naples, you have a clock, you set it in Naples. If your clock worked perfectly, you could take it with you on the trip.
Hmm.
Halfway across the ocean, you observe the sun and get the local noon, compare it to your clock giving time in Naples. That gives you your longitude.
Yeah.
But no clock they had at the time would actually keep good time on a
Hmm.
tossing ship of the
Yes.
accuracy needed to get longitude. You can imagine if you had a pendulum clock and the pendulum's getting tossed back and
Hmm.
forth by the waves. It wasn't until the Harrison chronometer was made in the early
Hmm.
1700s that someone devised a clock, a marine chronometer, that would keep the accurate time on shipboard.
Mm-hmm.
And this was he had to be it was a very difficult technical achievement of the early
Yes.
1700s. He had to be careful, not only worry about the shipboard motion, he worried about temperature changes during the voyage,
Yes.
because things would expand and contract, and that could
Mm-hmm.
throw you off too. And
Yes.
not until then uh, was the problem of longitude at sea solved. At land, you didn't have that. Once you got to the other side of the ocean where at land, if you had a good theory of, say, the motion of the moon, you could
Mm-hmm.
make observations with your telescope, carefully pin down the position of the moon with respect to nearby stars, and use that to get a time, a method of a lunar time that would work for finding longitude, at least for the accuracy they needed at the time, at the day. But it
Mm-hmm.
was really tough to try to do that from a shipboard, get
Oh
accurate
yeah.
telescopic measurements of the location of the moon compared to distant planets, and
Mm-hmm.
so that was really tough. Uh, so let's go back to our Antikythera machine. Can it be used for that kind of, as a Harrison chronometer? And I would say no, because although it's
Mm-hmm.
wonderful for the broad positions predicting eclipses, probably for the motions of the planets, there's nothing in it that I've seen in the models people made that give you
Let me throw that
the
back up
equivalent
there.
of a clock that would work at sea.
Right.
Other than, looks like it's people make it with a hand crank. A clock would
Mm-hmm.
need some kind of other driving mechanism, and it just seems to be
Springs, etc.
right, for a different purpose.
Right. So let me not really push back, more of a let's bring that thought back, because I agree with you, right? It's definitely, I was using him. I'll even throw this out here. My use of latitude and longitude was more of a generalized statement and not the specificity I would usually like. Not everyone has the sort of overall technical understanding of someone of your merit. So let me be a little bit more precise with my language. I agree. You would not be able to calculate longitude using this machine the way we do, right? The way we understand it, the way we process it. My experience, though, with archaeology is that, honestly, the people who do the worst job of understanding how ancient people did things are archaeologists. We every time there's this major theory about how something was manufactured, or how something was accomplished, how something was done, something comes along, and usually it's some dude who has nothing to do with archaeology. He's just he's just out there, trying to do flint knapping, and completely rewrites everything about how we understand that material. So I was being imprecise with my language. And again, I very much stipulate it's entirely possible the Antikythera, I'm way off track, and the Antikythera device has nothing to do with any kind of traversing anything. However, I think it is, I agree with you. You can't use it to do longitude the way we would calculate it, but I think it is unwise, given the history, considering how often our archaeologists get it wrong, to assume that it would have been impossible for them to have used it in a way that would have allowed them to traverse such a large distance using a technique that perhaps we would equate to latitude, longitude, but it's not the same process at all. In the same way that the Vikings used sunstones, which we don't even really fully understand. We were actually talking about this before the show, right? They had, in fact, let me throw this up here. This is a fragment of what's called a solar compass that they would help. I mean, they went all over the damn place with a crystal and in wooden, compasses like this. they were able to do some amazing things. Again, as I mentioned in that episode, the Polynesians were able to go all over the Pacific without any of this technology. So I'm, again, my bad for using the terms latitude and longitude without being a little bit more precise and saying that not the way we would understand it, but rather that it could be used as a way for them to make calculations necessary for such long distances across the Atlantic. Even if they went up to Britain and then moved over, right? Maybe they wouldn't have gone as far north, but they could have jumped over there. That's a larger distance you need to be able to make calculations on. The device could allow them to do what they needed to do to get there and back. Now, you can disagree with that, and I think that would also be valid, but let me give that mea culpa. The use of the word latitude and longitude is definitely probably highly inaccurate. So let me throw it back at you. Do you think it's possible that the machine could have been used in a way to make calculations necessary for such long trips?
First, let me make one comment on your statement about the archaeologists not always figuring out how the technology of the past. When I was a college student myself, I was fortunate enough to sit in on some lectures by Derek Sola Price, who was one of the pioneers in study of the Antikythera mechanism. He didn't get everything right. He got a lot wrong on it, but he pioneered. You're a pioneer. You're going to get some things wrong.
Oh, of course, absolutely.
But the lectures I sat in on, well, I was an astronomy student, but the lectures were designed for humanities students and archaeologists. And they were basics of astronomy, because your typical archaeologist is not really keyed up on how the motions of sun, moon, and planets in the sky. And Derek Solar said, well, you need a special course to tell you about this, because it's important. You find it in all this ancient writing, and you're not going to understand what you're coming across unless you have some background. So I was somewhat amusing. Now I get to say, no, I don't think you could use the Antikythera mechanism in the way that you mentioned. But I think one has to look at the technological tradition that might be, of which the Antikythera mechanism is only a part.
Right.
And I think you might begin with another kind of the gearing and the skill might be reflected in another kind of mechanism more directly related to navigation, the astrolabe, which goes back. We have lots of examples to medieval times, from medieval times. But again, the origins certainly go back much earlier and are kind of lost in the Hellenic several centuries BC era, probably at least. And
that's one, just for our viewers.
Some of them are very beautiful.
Yes.
I have one that's not this beautiful brass or bronze. It's cheap plastic, but it works.
Hey.
But is this? It looks simple in the picture you show. It looks like there's just some inscribed plates and maybe a rotating few things rotate. But there's an incredible amount of technology and science actually embedded within that simple-looking device. You could use it, at least the version on land. You could use it for measuring the and predicting the altitude of the sun at various times during the day, where on the horizon the sun would rise, where on the horizon stars would rise. You could use it for a shipboard version for getting a latitude.
That is a mariner's astrolabe for our viewers.
Rather simpler, but you have to be able to use it on a tossing ship
Mhm.
again. And certainly this shows an old tradition that not everyone had. Not everyone sailing seas in ancient times used it, but it shows an old tradition that was of a mechanical device used in navigation, at least for latitude.
Mhm.
And that goes back, as it said, the origins are rather mysterious as to when it developed. The origins of Greek astronomy have the Hellenic era, a few centuries BC, uh, as origins takes from the earlier Babylonian astronomy, uh, perhaps changes the way that the Greeks tended to want to make
Mhm.
mechanical models more than the ancient Babylonians did, perhaps. Uh, Picture a geometric world rather than the world of cycles, as
Yeah.
the Babylonians may have been more interested in. Um, so one, so I would pose the alternative,
Mhm.
not that the Antikythera device itself would be the device that would be useful for celestial navigation, but that the technological tradition and scientific tradition from which the Antikythera mechanism arose uh, could have in alternative devices navigational abilities, certainly for latitude, longitude. I'm not
Mhm.
sure whether that was worked out for at sea as opposed to on land until till
Right.
the Harrison chronometer. Um, uh,
Which, by the way, I've seen replicas of the Harrison chronometer. It is insane. Like the fact that I remember seeing it taking like the pieces and all. I'm like, somebody figured this out. It's insane. It's nuts.
and it's Harrison. Of course, there was the English government had
Mhm.
offered a big prize,
Yeah.
a fortune in the money of the time for the person who solved the problem. And that was the motivation for Harrison. And some
Yep.
blame the
Mhm.
astronomers for trying to shift some of that money over to them for the lunar method, which wasn't as good, but was cheaper. The Harrison chronometer
Yeah.
was pretty expensive at the beginning. Um,
Oh yeah.
uh, yeah, it's an amazing device. I don't know that we have any ancient tradition in surviving objects that would be anything like of the Harrison chronometer as opposed to
Right.
these other
No.
devices.
And I would, yeah, I would completely agree with if someone were to say, hey, we have particularly, I'm going back to the Bronze Age collapse, an example of something like the Harrison chronometer, I'd laugh. Like I've got friends sending me videos like, hey, ancient mega batteries. I'm like, no, just stop. Not That's not a thing. Um so let me, in fact, you shared a video with me. I've got it in the description below. I love it was a really interesting lecture. It's actually one of the more recent lectures on this subject. It's a couple years old, but it's um, sort of the more up to date information. And if you're interested in the Antikythera device, it's a great video. I love the lecture. They've got a lot of recreations, so you can kind of and he explores the history of how we know what it is. I would like to state for the record, at no point do I disagree with any of their observations at all about the machine itself, how it works, what it's about. I'm 100% on track. I will say one thing though. He kept one of his associates. His name's Alex Jones. I kept laughing. I kept chuckling every time I heard him say that because I just, I just had this vision in my head of the Alex Jones, the radio host, was being like, the Antikythera device made the frogs gay. Um, I could not stop laughing at that thought. But he made several. Like I said, I don't disagree with him at all. In fact, I think he's very much on point with what it is, how it worked, and he brought up several points. Actually, he made several points that I made in the episode that we're discussing I just kind of take it back further, which is he says, look, the Antikythera device itself represents a. He's like, this is not a prototype. This is perfect. There's no mistakes. There's no like them. It's like this thing is perfect, which means there had to be more. He puts it to Archimedes, a few other notable Greek engineers at the time. Let me throw one question out here to you, and because again, the Antikythera device, you don't think it would have been useful the way I'm describing it and maybe that's absolutely true. I'm not gonna, it's a theory. I even say, I may be completely off base with it, right? However, the idea that maybe it represents much older technology, in that it's not that Archimedes and these other guys were necessarily creating all of this out of whole cloth, but rather that they are inheritors of older technologies, which is why you have these very specific centers where these things sort of appeared. They call them, I had to write it down, spheroi. I had this other word in my head. But we have documentations of these machines, although no one knows if it's something like the Antikythera device or just similar technologies called spheroi, which appear to be, from the writings, at least similar in function to the Antikythera device. And of course, Archimedes isn't the only one to have them. But do you think it's possible that they represent, if the Iron Age, particularly about the time frame that they're working, is would, from our perspective, be sort of like the Renaissance period where they've rediscovered older writings, older technologies, and they're sort of bringing it all back and they're making it useful again? Do you think the Antikythera device could represent something like that? Or is it more likely that it's just there was development from the Bronze Age collapse to that time frame, and we've just lost that development?
I think there are aspects of that I certainly don't know, and that probably no one does right now. One can think of two trends that we are ignorant of.
Mm-hmm.
There's the trend of the pure technological development, the ability to make the gears, to do the work of meshing the gears, of making these all these complications that was spelled out in that lecture that you provide the link to.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's a second necessary part of it, which is the science or understanding of the motions of the sky that needs to be embedded within the technological device.
Right.
Now we can trace the science. We know that, of course, the ancient Greeks of the few centuries BC had developed this science for explaining the motions, the epicycle motion of the planets.
Mm-hmm.
We know, however, that they derived their understanding of their knowledge of cycles in the sky from earlier civilizations, probably through the world of ancient Mesopotamia and thereabouts. Certainly, that's where we know from ancient cuneiform texts that they did observe the sky and knew about cycles in the sky. And what we have not uncovered, to my knowledge, from those earlier ancient times is a physical incorporation of the surviving device,
right,
that incorporates those cycles. As we know, they had a lot of technology. They built the ziggurats. Of course, the Egyptians made pyramids 5,000 years ago or whatever. So they had a lot of technology of various types. But after all, if this ship going to Rome or wherever that carried the Antikythera device had not sunk, we would not have this device. If we had not found the device, we would not know at all, except for a few mysterious writings about
Yes.
this whole technological tradition.
That is one of my favorite parts of that. Again, I recommend everyone just go, even if you're not overly interested in the Antikythera device, it is worth, like, it's an hour and a half of your life. While listen to it while you're gardening, because he makes a really great point that we sort of lightly touched on, but not nearly to the point that he did, which is people recycle things. Bronze being as valuable material, we know that there were all these different statues that we can't find anymore because they were melted down to be used to something else. It is entirely likely, and whether we're talking about the Bronze Age collapse or even later, we could all these bronze. The reason we may not have access to this technology is because it's been recycled. Particularly if the Bronze Age collapse was as devastating as it was, and we know that it was. There could be all kinds of things that they had that they melted down because they couldn't use it anymore. It didn't mean anything to them anymore. And we don't have any real records of it. I mean, writing took a dip during, the Bronze Age collapse on. There's no way to know. Was there a steady stream of technological development in particular cities that culminate with these things? Was there, hey, we had these things, then things got bad, and then we're sort of rediscovering these things? There's no way to know because people recycled. We've always recycled things, and bronze is one of the most. There's a reason we still use it today for tons of things. It's an important material, and that loss means we don't really. Again, there's no way to know how this happened.
It would be tremendous if we had the second one of them.
Yeah.
And as our lecturer remarked, and as you've just remarked, that may not happen unless we find another one on another shipwreck.
Yeah,
because
that
that's
we can date
where
it.
the material would not be recycled. You might find it as just another lump of corroded material, so it may be hard to figure out what it was. Another possibility that I believe the lecturer raised had to do with whether there were more comprehensive books. Cicero wrote and mentioned these other spheroid devices that sound like they're similar to the Antikythera device.
Yeah.
And there's a lost book of Archimedes that may describe these devices. Whether or not he invented them, it could be that he's just talking about how to make one, and might have said something about the whole development of the idea. But as with almost all of the ancient literature, it's lost. Unless someone comes up with digging in the library in Herculaneum or somewhere, comes up with a lost charred document that modern technology allows us to read, we may never get them back. A lot of the
100%.
things that come up, a lot of the things that come up in those ancient libraries are kind of boring things today. The guy's philosophical book that no one cares about now, and that we have, and Archimedes we don't.
Okay, and this is a great example. There's two things that make this even worse, but a great example of what we're talking about. These things are called Roman dodecahedrons. They are found all over the ancient world. We know they come from the Roman period, but we have no idea what they are. When I mean we have no idea, I mean we have zero idea as to what these things are. We don't even know their names. We call them the Roman dodecahedrons because we have no other word for it. These things aren't described in any book that we found. They aren't given names. We don't find paintings of them or mosaics of them. We have no idea what these are, and they're everywhere. There's actually been a recent trend of people creating 3D printing them, and people using them as forms for knitting. And of course, I was like, well, we know it. My favorite thing is everyone's like, look, we know that's probably not what they used them for. And I'm over here like, no, you can't say that. You literally have no idea what they used them for at all. It may be that these grandmothers, they're randomly using them to knit I think they said it was easier to knit like gloves using them, but they were used to knit certain things. They're like, you have no idea. That may be exactly what they were used for. And that because they're so common, no one bothered to write about it because it's, that's women's work. We don't need to worry about that. Everyone knows what they are.
How big are they? I've never seen one.
They seem to be about like that. I've seen, now there are some that are larger, some that are smaller, but they all seem to be about like that from what I've seen. I've never handled one personally. I've seen a Spartan helmet. Like those are, you'd be surprised how small those things are. Like an actual Grecian Spartan helmet. You're like, I remember the first time I saw one, I'm like, I feel like that's a child's helmet. Like I thought it was a toy. I really did because it's so small. But yeah, like nobody knows what these stupid dodecahedrons are at all. No one's got a clue. There's not a single text, treatise. There's no paintings, mosaics showing them being used. We have no clue. They could be literally anything. But
right,
that's the point. We don't.
Yeah, we don't. So with the Antikythera device itself, I said I just can't figure out a way where that would lead you to navigation. It would lead you to predicting eclipses, but you don't want to base your navigation on
eclipses.
Waiting for an eclipse.
Right. So let me explain. So actually, let me play with that a little bit. Let me sort of walk you through my thinking on it, because you're right. The eclipses aren't going to be a thing. However, I could see them saying, "Hey, we have this long trip. We know that allows you to calculate." Let me rephrase this. We surmise, we theorize, it would allow you to calculate positions of the moon against the backdrop of the stars, phases, placement, as well as the 5 classical planets. I could see them having a way of utilizing that to calculate a trip, both when it's the best time to do it, and use it as a way of saying, okay, well, we know this is the amount of time it takes to do X, Y, Z. Again, I'm using time in a very generalized, not, tick, tick, tick thing, but more generalized. I could see them using that knowledge to make a voyage, to calculate a voyage out. And again, maybe other aspects of this that again, none of us are going to think of because we don't have that level of technology. That's not where we live at. The same way that one guy probably figured out how they actually moved these megalithic blocks with pebbles and just, he's moving multi-ton blocks by himself with wooden pallets. They may have had a way of using that to make those kinds of calculations. They're just radically different from how we would do it. And so I just don't think we can take that out of the box, or out of the possibility. However, I do like your point. And maybe this may be a bigger point, that it's not the Antikythera device itself, but rather what it represents is a descendant of the technology that was used. Where I come from, and I think my main hangup is this: something stopped the Minoans from going from the Mediterranean to the New World and back. We know those trips were being made. Which again is just one of those things that modern archaeologists don't like to talk about. There's a lot of things they don't like to talk about because it doesn't fit the paradigm. But we know they were making that trip, and it's entirely possible that's what supplied a lot of the copper for the Minoans to be as powerful as they were. Something stopped them from making that trip. At some point they said, we can't do this anymore. I've always chalked that up to loss of some kind of technology that would have allowed them to make the calculations to go from point A to point B. However, when you gave the pushback, I thought about it a little bit more, and something clicked. And I want to run this past you. We can come back to the Antikythera device. I don't want to get rid of it, but one of the things we did talk about on both episodes was the destruction of Thera, which again, now it's Santorini. That's the caldera. And the destruction of, when that thing blew, it probably, not only did it change the ecology of the Mediterranean and the surrounding area, this thing probably would have wiped out whole fleets of ships. and really just jacked up navigation for a long time, probably destroying very important ships. What if I'm going to throw myself under the bus on this one? What if I have the order wrong? It isn't that the Minoans lost the ability to go from point A to point B, and then the lack of copper led to an economic collapse. What if there was an economic collapse caused by Santorini, and that economic collapse prevented them from mounting these long trips across the Atlantic? Because one of the big, I was thinking about the Vikings, again, going back to the whole sun compass thing. Everyone sort of has this idea that the reason the Vikings would go a Viking, right? The Danes and the Scandinavians would go a Viking was that they were poor. And that's not what it was. You could only make those kinds of expeditions if you had a strong economic base to field them. So it may be maybe the Antikythera device has nothing to do with any of this at all, but that the reason for the Bronze Age collapse is that Santorini wipes out enough and causes enough of an economic hardship that the Minoans can no longer afford to send ships to get the copper to bring back. And it's just a continuance of a collapse from that point on. They no longer have, they can't afford to go get it anymore. It's like if you had a car, but you could no longer afford gas, it wouldn't matter how far you had to drive to get gas. You can't buy it anyway. You can't go and get it. That car becomes useless to you.
Well, now you're getting into an area that is beyond my expertise to really.
Which is fine.
I don't know the arguments on the extent of Minoan voyages very well. We do know that if we think about the age of exploration in the 1400s and 1500s, that did require a development of a certain level of economy to make that possible, and of technology, shipbuilding technology as well. They did actually maintain their empires without the Harrison chronometers, so you don't necessarily need a means of finding longitude at sea. You're unhappy if you sail into an island and sink your ship, but you still don't have a it can be done.
Yep.
It
He
can be
pays your money, he
done.
takes your chances.
And using other kinds of navigation. You have dead reckoning. You have people, those who study the motions of the waves, of when you see birds flying out from the land, and everything putting together. Now that must be true to some extent for long distance voyages. But then I go to the Pacific Ocean and I think of the Polynesian expansion. And there we see a sophistication of a different type. So you don't need the European kind of galleons or
exactly
sailing vessels to do this. You do have to have great knowledge and skill in some kind of navigation, but not necessarily with the mechanical devices of chronometers and similar devices. So people are more ingenious in ancient times than one often gives them credit for, and not everyone is necessarily exploiting this with the same mechanism. The sailing the Pacific and sailing the Atlantic they require different traditions, and the hard part, and I don't think it can be solved without someone coming up with more discoveries, is how this technological and scientific tradition of the Antikythera mechanism arises, and who invented these things, and how extensive it was. And there we're stuck because of the issues we've already mentioned. We
Yep.
have one corroded lump.
Yeah.
We have
That's
mentions
it.
of devices, very brief by Cicero, and the actual books that may have described them and maybe more about different versions of them are lost.
Yep.
So we got to get underwater. We got to get looking at those old shipwrecks and hoping that some poor crew carrying these devices
Yep.
or perhaps their predecessors, perhaps other versions, perhaps things we have no conception of being made at the time. If we don't find them, we will never know.
Yep.
We may never. It may be a problem that we can't solve with it
And
because the information is lacking.
no, 100%. In fact, this is the other part. I said there's two problems here. Again, talking about the recycling, but here's the other problem. And to your point, let's say we find a shipwreck, right? That has another one of these devices. That doubles our information of them, but it also doesn't necessarily get us somewhere unless that shipwreck is from a different time frame where we can do something with it. Because let's imagine 1,000 years from now, someone finds a shipwreck and it's got all kinds of statues on it, including the Venus de Milo. But all records of the Venus de Milo are gone, right?
Okay.
It would be very easy for them to say, okay, well, this statue of the Venus de Milo comes from the same time frame as this modern ship. Let's say some guy goes and buys the Venus de Milo and it's on his boat and it sinks. Some people 1,000 years from now who have no idea what the Venus de Milo is could see that and be like, yeah, this was carved by somebody in 2037, right? There would be no way for them to know that the Venus de Milo is significantly older, right? And so that's one of those. To your point, you're right. And unless there's a shipwreck, and the speaker was very, very cognizant of the fact that unless we have something underwater where people couldn't recycle it, we're not going to get any more data on these things. But the problem is, all we can say is it was on that ship. We don't really know when it was manufactured originally, or if it or what the tradition it represents. Does it represent something that was being developed at the time, or does it represent something that was older that was being rediscovered? We don't know. And we probably, to your point, we won't ever really know unless we can find, unless there's some library out there with a book made of lead or copper that has all these inscriptions and dates on it that says, hey, we found this thing, it's BC diggity, and this thing's old to us. Like, unless we find something like that, we will never know. It's a complete, it's all speculation at this point because of that. Which is a real tragedy.
Right. We might hope that we come across a shipwreck where there's not a duplicate of the Antikythera device, but some other device showing the technological tradition, the scientific tradition, but maybe for a totally different purpose. Just to reveal a little more of the extent of the abilities and knowledge of the time. But it may be we'd never come across another one. It may be that there was one on a shipwreck and it was dashed to little pieces and totally destroyed in the wreck itself.
Yeah. I mean, there could have been two on that ship, and this is the only one we found. I mean, that's the other problem, right? Like, it has to survive enough for us to recognize it to be a thing, or it has to be buried along with the shipwreck. It couldn't have just, like, if it fell off a quarter of a mile away, it's gone forever. Right.
We do owe a debt, however, to the Greek sponge divers of the around 1900 who actually found the shipwreck in the first place, and were more impressed by as was the government, more impressed by the ancient statues that were in the wreck than this little lump. But think if someone just left that little lump behind, when they were
Yeah, we'd never know.
excavating. Said,
Yeah.
here's a ship, here's a statue of Poseidon. I want that. I don't want this little lump.
Okay, and I mean this very sincerely. I got one more point before we go, as far as why I do think the Antikythera device may represent something older, but that's a great point. And again, as someone who's a student of archaeology, I've had this thought has been in my head forever. How often do people find things that are remarkably important, and they just don't recognize it for what it is, and it gets chucked somewhere, right? Like some farmer is tilling up his field and he hits something. Some miner is excavating something. He doesn't recognize it and just goes, it's in a quarry, gone forever. It's in a trash pile, gone forever. No one has any clue that this really important artifact that could change everything even exists, because someone found it. They have no idea what it is, and it's gone. In fact, as an artist, I was reading, it's called the Artist Handbook. It's literally like the Bible for artists, for classical artists who like to do oil paints. There's an article on, there's a chemical called liquin. It's a dryer for oil paint, because oil takes forever to dry, right? And they pointed out that it's entirely possible that artists would have had access to liquin over 100 years earlier if chemists had actually stopped to ask an artist, hey, can you use this for something? Because chemists have noticed that there were all these unusable gelatinous compounds that would be developed, and they just said, we can't do anything with it, and they threw it out. It's entirely possible that there's 100 different chemists that created liquin 100 different times, and because they had no idea that it would have those properties, they just threw away a multi-million-dollar, patent, and artists weren't able to use it until the late 20th century because it didn't cross their mind that this had other applicable uses. So, that's one of the problems that we have with this whole thing is there may be all kinds of things that people have dug up, and they're like, whatever, right? They don't know what it is. They don't care. It doesn't mean anything to them. It's a lump, and it's lost to history. It's just gone.
Right. The only thing that called attention to this particular piece was that there was that surviving big gear that showed on the front, the front side. If you had it been a corroded lump all over, and that's been cleaned up, that what you see there. If it had been just corroded lump all over, unless you were a very meticulous archaeologist, and now today I'm sure they recover a more complete wrecks than they probably did in 1901. But unless you were meticulous, you might have left that behind, and a groundbreaking discovery would be lost in the bottom of the ocean.
That's
so. Yeah, I'm sure. If you're interested in old silent films, you get dismayed when you realize that 90% of the silent films that once were made are already lost.
Yeah, they're gone forever.
Now bronze is a little different and things like that. But when you go back to ancient times, we think of what an incredible fraction of what was built and made is then must now be lost. And many of that stuff maybe we're not so interested in. You've seen one plow, how a basic plow is made. That I suppose is a bad example because there have been revolutions in plow technology.
They really have.
But the more rare, the things that take more understanding to figure out even that they're significant. You must be thinking of 99.99% of the ones that were made being lost to time now.
No, and that's because that's really, I think, the big problem that we have here is I look at the Antikythera device, and we don't see a whole lot of surrounding technological developments that would allow for something that sophisticated to exist. It's like we don't, most people don't think about these things. My dad did. He was a mechanic. One thing he was talking about is how the first automobiles would have been impossible without perfume. And I was like, wait, what? The technology to do a spray perfume bottle was integral to the development of the car, the gasoline internal combustion engine, because you have to vaporize and aerosolize the gasoline in order for it to be compressed and ignite, because gasoline burns, it doesn't explode unless it's under an appropriate pressure. Without a bunch of French women spraying themselves with perfume, we wouldn't have cars. And so for me, when I'm looking at the Antikythera device, I'm like, okay, but we don't see a lot of the associated developments that you would need for something that's sophisticated. But to the point that we're making, all that could just have been melted down, because bronze is a remarkably important, material for making other things. It could be that this represents older technology. Could be that it was developed by Archimedes himself and his friends. And they're like, but we have no way of knowing, because all those materials were probably just melted down to make weapons or some other tool, maybe a plow. Some dude needed a plow. And it's like, well, here's all these, gears and things that I don't need because it was destroyed in some raid. I'll turn it into a plate, or I'll turn it into a helmet, or I'll turn it into something else. And so all the evidence of that is gone. And it's a dang shame. But you know what? Maybe out there somewhere is a boat with the key that will unlock the Antikythera device, or at least maybe give us the name for this damn thing.
I hope so.
So, Horace, I'm going to have to bring you on again for, yes, folks, I am going to do a Flat Earth episode, and I will be bringing Horace on for that as well. But Horace, thank you for taking your time to come hang out with me, talk about the Antikythera device. I'm sorry we didn't have the green Jello to wrestle around in, but, this was just as good.
Well, I was delighted to be here. And in fact, on a number of points, we were not that far apart, actually.
Yeah, I think we mostly agree. It's just there's a few points. Again, I'll even say I think you appropriately took me to the woodshed on is the longitude, is my statement about longitude. I was going for a broader concept, but I used that word. And I think you were right to call me out on that. And again, the real issue here is we have nothing but theories, because we ain't got any real evidence either way. There's just no way to know, because it's lost to time.
Oh, well, I'll go out, start looking in my backyard.
Yeah, start digging, man. We're waiting on you. But you know what isn't lost to time are your books. So again, tell everyone where they can find your works.
Well, the books that are out at the moment are most easily obtained through Amazon. Books like Cruel War and Cursed Rebellion, the Civil War book, The Great Meteor Procession, Romantic Skies, and coming out through Hippocampus Press later in the month will be When the Stars Are Right, H.P. Lovecraft and Astronomy, with co-author Eddie Guimont. And that was a lot of fun to write, and I hope people find it interesting.
And no doubt we will be talking about that one on Untold Radio once that's published. I'm looking forward to that one. I've got more than a passing interest in stars. And so again, Horace, thank you. We'll have to do this again sometime. Appreciate you being on.
Thank you for inviting me.
And guys, like, follow, subscribe, share this out. You know the drill. We'll catch y'all next time.